The Gloam-Eyed Queen remains one of my favourite subjects in Elden Ring, and in this video I want to discuss what little we know about her. However, before we jump into this video, I want to acknowledge a great video by content creator Last Protagonist, as their video on the Gloam-Eyed Queen has been instrumental in my fundamental ideas on the subject, and so while I will reference them directly at certain points, I wanted to acknowledge their influence in a general sense. The identity of the Gloam-Eyed Queen has always been somewhat of a mystery, and so with that said, let us unpack some of these possibilities. I'd like to start by examining the very nature of the Gloam-Eyed Queen herself and what she perhaps represents. Gloam is defined as the following according to Collins Dictionary: twilight, or the darker part of twilight, and it is ultimately synonymous with dusk, and so the removal of the one instance of a dusk-eyed queen in one of the patches doesn't really hold a huge significance. However, what does hold significance is the already existing connection between dusk and death. For example, in the ending that relates to those who live in death and Godwin, is called the Age of the Duskborn. This of course makes sense, having a symbolic tie to the Gloam-Eyed Queen, given that she was once connected and channeled the power of the Rune of Death, which is ultimately the artifact responsible for the creation of the Prince of Death and those who live in death. The connection between dusk or gloam and death, in a metaphorical sense, is pretty easy to understand. Dusk is the end of the day, and death is the end of one's life. They are both the twilight of something. Indeed, the term Gloam-Eyed could just be a reference to her purpose, to bring death to Marika and her godkin, heralding the twilight of the Age of the Gods. And in a way, if we consider the time in which we are suggesting her rise took place, the Age of Plenty, the Gloam-Eyed Queen's domain is very much an inversion of this. The Age of Plenty, the Age of Crucible, is essentially an age of vitality and abundance, an age of life unrestrained. Whereas the Gloam-Eyed Queen, the representative of the Black Flame and destined death, brought death, the complete mirror of the age of life and abundance. A great observation about this thematic inversion was made by content creator Quailag on Twitter, who said the following: Enea refers to the Rune of Destined Death as the shadow of the Golden Order. The Rune of Death goes by two names, the other is Destined Death, the forbidden shadow plucked from the Golden Order upon its creation, which makes sense as it's inverted from Marika's crucifix. I think this is a really powerful observation by Quailag here, that the Gloam-Eyed Queen's rune very much represented an inversion to Marika, the literal shadow to her rule, and as Quailag points out, it does look like an inversion of Marika's rune. Indeed, it is possible that Marika's original rune is a rune of life, and therefore the Rune of Death would be the literal shadow to Marika's rune. The reasoning for this potential speculation comes from a tweet by content creator Sekiro, who tweeted about an item description found in version 1 of the game. In this version of the game, the icon shield, a shield that depicts the Age of Plenty, mentions a Rune of Life. Whilst of course this is cut content and shouldn't necessarily be considered canon, it does for me make more sense to Quailag's idea of the Rune of Death literally being an inversion or shadow to Queen Marika's rule, potentially the Rune of Life. And the Rune of Life would make sense for Marika, given that the Erdtree is the nexus of life in the lands between, especially in the Age of Plenty. Whoever the Gloam-Eyed Queen was, it is clear that her power, the power of the Black Flame that is used by her and her apostles, was channeled by her signature weapon, the Godslayer Greatsword, the description of which reads the following: The black flames wielded by the apostles are channeled from this sword. This suggests that the flames themselves, even the ones wielded by the apostles and the nobles, are directly channeled from the Rune of Death by this sword. It is a medium between the two, really highlighting the importance of this weapon to the Godskin movement. Last protagonist makes some very interesting observation in regards to the sword, highlighting its double helix structure that is not dissimilar from the sacred relic sword, a weapon made from the body of a god. Perhaps this sword itself was made via a similar process, and we know the Nox have experience in making weapons from corpses like the Finger Slayer blade. Despite the nightmarish concept of making a person into a sword, we know that such swords do hold important power. For example, the Finger Slayer blade seems to be the only blade capable of harming a two fingers. Therefore, it is fairly logical to assume that given its double helix DNA-esque shape, that the Godslayer blade could also be one that was made from a corpse for a special purpose, the purpose of channeling the power of the Rune of Death. In his Gloam-Eyed Queen video, Last Protagonist does even suggest a theory that it could be possible that the sword is the Gloam-Eyed Queen herself, that she was the one who is able to channel the Black Flame, and thus the sword is able to. And following her defeat, she was turned into a sword, suffering a similar fate to Marika and Radagon as a punishment upon her defeat. Another fascinating detail about the Godslayer Greatsword is that it exactly matches the shape of the Rune of Death. If you turn it point facing down, you can see with its downward facing hilt that it perhaps takes the shape of the Rune of Death, and this could be used as an argument to say that the sword was indeed once the Gloam-Eyed Queen, that it takes the shape of the Rune of Death because of her relation to this rune. However, I am more of a mind that this is a purpose-built sword for the Gloam-Eyed Queen, due to the fact that it is a highly detailed sword. Both the Sacred Relic sword and the Finger Slayer blade are more primal in their aspect, whereas the entire design of the Godslayer Greatsword does seem to suggest that it was purpose-made, hence why its design is so highly detailed. The sword is being designed to evoke the idea of the Rune of Death itself, the pivotal artifact to the Gloam-Eyed Queen's power and the movement of the Godskins, and I think the idea that it represents the Rune of Death is better captured by this fan-made footage by Eugenia, that portrays the Gloam-Eyed Queen standing victorious over a fallen god, bringing its point down on her foe, the Rune of Death hanging over the heads of the gods. Not only does it seem to have been forged in the very shape of the Rune of Death, but it also seems to display a swirling flame. It's not really a double helix. To me it looks like a flame going upwards, no doubt evoking the very black flame it is used to channel. And to me it also seems designed specifically to channel the flame, again human-made, due to the gap in its centre, from which the black flame will emerge. However, I do leave the matter of the sword up to you to decide, whether it is a sword made from a corpse, if it's the Gloam-Eyed Queen herself, or if it was designed with the specifics of the Gloam-Eyed Queen's requirements in mind. With that said, let us return to the matter of the Gloam-Eyed Queen's identity. Now, I have heard many people make the argument that they have to be related to Marika, and if we consider the other existing Empyreans that we know of, this does make some sort of sense. Melina and Mikla are direct offsprings of Marika, and depending on your viewpoint, Ranni is the daughter of Marika's other personality, or at the very least, is Marika's stepdaughter. However, we have to remember that at one stage, Marika herself was chosen as an Empyrean, and so we aren't sure 100% on the situation surrounding her election to godhood, and so we can't be certain in nailing down the prerequisites of Empyrean status. Yet if I was to go out on a limb, I would say that Empyrean status can be a combination of both blood relation and or potential. With that said, I can't help but think the Gloam-Eyed Queen would thematically fit within the Eternal Cities, being related to the Numen, Marika's kin. Whether she is directly related to the Queen or not, of course we will look at that potential later. The connections between the Nox, the Numen, and Queen Marika herself are well known to the community at this stage, with the Black Knife Assassin armour telling us the assassins are Numen and kin to Marika, whilst Rogier also refers to them as scions of the Eternal City. And in general, for a history of the Nox, I would recommend both my video on the Eternal Cities and Tarnished Archaeologist video on the Eternal Empire for 2 different accounts on the history of the Eternal Cities and the Nox. But whatever you believe about the Eternal Cities and the Nox, it is clear that this is a divergent Numen society that very much oppose the Greater Will, as the armour set for the Nox reads the following. Long ago, the Nox invoked the ire of the Greater Will, and were banished deep underground. Now they live under a false sky, in eternal anticipation of their liege, of the coming age of stars, and their Lord of Night. So it is clear that these are a people who have acted directly against the Greater Will, leading to their banishment underground. However, as I have already argued, the Godskin Apostasy isn't really an attack against the Greater Will, and is more against Marika herself, and it falls within the natural cycles overseen by the Greater Will. However, this is not to say that the Gloam-Eyed Queen could not have come from these people, either before or after their banishment, and if it did come after when they were known as the Nox, one cannot help but think they would still get a great joy with laying Marika low and bringing an end to her Age of Plenty. So when looking at the possible connections to the Eternal City, I'd like to look at one of my favourite lore items in the game, the Godskin Swaddling Cloth, and this item reads the following. Sacred cloth of the Godskin Apostles, made from supple skin sewn together. The Gloam-Eyed Queen cradles newborn apostles swaddled in this cloth. Soon they will grow to become the death of the gods. This has always been a striking image to me, of the Gloam-Eyed Queen cradling newborn apostles, a scene that Eugenia has incredibly brought to life for this video. From the moment they are born, they are cradled by the Gloam-Eyed Queen, and this makes it abundantly clear that the Godskins are not regular humans, nor are they recruited. Not only that, but it says that soon they will grow to become the death of the gods, and to me this has always suggested some kind of accelerated growth, and combined that they are apostles from their very birth, leads me to conclude that they are artificial life forms, raised up by the Gloam-Eyed Queen herself. There is of course a people who are very familiar with creating an artificial life form, the Eternal Cities, and we have discussed this many times on the channel before, but for the sake of this video, let us again look at the creations of the Nox when we're trying to discuss the connections to the Godskins. One of the most obvious examples of the Eternal City tampering with life is the Dragonkin soldiers, who we can learn of via the Frozen Lightning incantation, which reads, "The Dragonkin were born in the Eternal City, where they knew no true sky, nor true lightning," and via the Dragon Scale Blade, which reads, "Alas, the Dragonkin soldiers never attained immortality, and perished as decrepit, pale imitations of their skyborn kin." While crude, these tortured failures are evidence of the Eternal's proclivity for tampering with life, and if we consider the Noxian interest in alchemy, then the sky's the limit. When we talk of alchemy, we can of course refer to the Celestial Dew, a fate-altering tonic, and the Puppet Draft, again a tonic which manipulates fate to leverage control over living beings. This alchemical manipulation could have potentially ended up in the creation of the Silver Tears. In a cut quest which has been recreated by Nulrin, there was a Silver Tear by the name of Asimi who we could dialogue with. We would essentially take this Asimi into our body so she could begin to copy our form, whilst apparently granting us power. If we came to the Eternal Cities, Asimi would name this her home. Then, while at the Eternal Cities, she would mention that there is a chalice nearby, the cradle of her kind. The Silver Tears are liquid in nature, and of course a chalice contains liquid, and to me it suggests that the Silver Tears were born of alchemical manipulation by the Nox, and given their purpose, they can mimic the form of other creatures, we could speculate that these beings were created so they could mimic the form of a Lord of Night. And although this is cut content, the presence of the Silver Tears all over the Eternal Cities for me implies that this is still the implication, that the Silver Tears were created by the Eternal Cities, and this is why we actually see Silver Tears fighting alongside the Nox. The Albinaurics are also potentially tied as creations of the Nox via a cut dialogue from Tops, who would have directly named them as creations of the Eternal Cities. And given the Nox's predilection for manipulating life, again the Albinaurics could well have been a creation of theirs to try and create an artificial Lord of Night, although again that is just speculation. But in general, there's a lot of evidence pointing to the Nox and the Eternal Cities as the birthplace of many forms of artificial life. So with that in mind, let us look at the actual physiology of the Godskins themselves. They are pale-skinned like malleable clay, much like the Albinaurics and Silver Tears, and all of the Godskins look identical in appearance, like clones. Also, like the Silver Tears and the silver weapons of the Nox, the Godskin Apostles are malleable, able to stretch out and contort in unusual manners. Again, just reinforcing the fact that these are not natural beings. There's of course the lore of the swaddling cloth that we have already looked at, suggesting that the Gloam-Eyed Queen rears every single one from birth, and I hope that even if you don't agree with the Eternal City connection, that we can all agree that these are not natural beings. These are not just humans who have been recruited into a movement. There is also another potential connection between the Godskin Apostles and the Eternal Cities, and this is the death of Eugenia. And this is something I've talked about in other videos, but upon the completion of Ranni's questline, her vassals are assaulted by Black Knife assassins. Both Eugenia and Blythe have the corpses of Black Knife assassins surrounding them, and yet, curiously, Eugenia is also burning in the black flame, not the red flame of destined death, but the black god-slaying flame of the Godskins. Now, some have argued that this may be a mistake and it was meant to be the red flame, yet I feel this would have been corrected in a patch if it was, like the Dusk-Eyed Queen being removed from the Godslayer Greatsword in a patch. So what does this actually mean? Well, if they are both connected to the Eternal Cities, then perhaps it is a hit squad, organised by the Eternal Cities. Reasonings for this assault is something I've gone over in more detail in my Night of the Black Knives video, but in short, I feel like Ranni left the Black Knife assassins high and dry, and we even find Electo, the leader, imprisoned in Ranni's Everjail up on Moonlight Altar. So Eugenie's death is a curious one, but if the Godskins are creations of the Eternal Cities, then this hit, a combined force of Black Knife assassins and the Godskins, could well make sense. Aside from the creation of the Godskins potentially being linked to the Eternal City, there are some other possible loose allusions that could be used to connect the Gloam-Eyed Queen herself to the Eternal City culture. One of these is the fact that I have long believed that the Eternal City race is a matriarchal one. Firstly, among the Nox there are the Night Maidens, who appear to occupy a preeminent position in society, with their set making it clear they are important enough to have swordstress bodyguards. There's also the fact that Queen Marika herself, who rose to become the god of the current era, came from this society, and her preeminence could suggest a matriarchal nature to the Numen people. But aside from that, there's also the idea that the moon, an important facet of Nox society, is more associated with the feminine. Ranni and Rennala, the two most important lunar figures in the game, are women as well, and it is a long-standing concept within Souls games that women are associated with the moon. Again, if we consider Gwendolyn from Dark Souls, who was raised as a woman because of his strong affinity to the moon. As we discussed in my Ranni lore video, this concept could be tied in to the philosophy of yin and yang, where yin can mean the moon and represents the feminine, forming one half of a system of balance. So it isn't hard to conclude that Noxian society is most likely matriarchal because of the preeminence of the moon, and if the moon is more connected to the feminine, this is why it's matriarchal. so it isn't hard to believe that the Gloam-Eyed Queen could have once been a queen of Numen or Noxian tradition, a once queen of the Eternal Cities. This is all speculation ultimately, but I do find it fairly compelling, especially when we consider the artificial nature of the Godskins themselves. And so to conclude, I do speculate that the Gloam-Eyed Queen comes from the same stock as Marika, whether she be directly related to her or not, and whether that means she was a Nox, a Numen, or another distant relation or offshoot. There is one other interesting concept I would like to talk about before we begin naming a specific candidate, and that is the potential tie of serpents to the Gloam-Eyed Queen. This was an idea first brought to my attention by a viewer who commented on one of my community posts. The Epic H88 stated that they believe the Gloam-Eyed Queen was a serpent. This set my mind racing, and shout out to Epic H88 for getting me to pick up this connection. And also credit to Tarnished Archaeologist's Serpent and the Erdtree video, which only further compounded my own ideas on this subject. So when talking about the serpent's place within the Elden Ring mythos, a good place to start is the Duelist set, which reads the following. The snake is viewed as a traitor to the Erdtree, and the audience delighted in seeing those bronze effigies beaten and battered. The snake was very much the focus of gladiatorial combat, and in essence the crowd wanted to see these snakes beaten down into the dirt. And not only did it feature on the limited armour of the duelists, these gladiators, but there is also the coil shield, a snake shield that was designed for gladiatorial combat. Again, a medium through which the people of the Erdtree society could see the serpent getting what it deserved. Now we do need to ask the question, why is the snake so hated even at this time? Because we know that gladiatorial combat is a practice dating back to the time of Godfrey, given his warrior aesthetic, his lion rampart being present in the entrances to the Colosseum, and the fact that this practice had died out by the time of Radagon, as told to us by the ritual sword talisman. So surely this is far before Rykard would become the Serpent of Blasphemy, and bring his blasphemous war against the Erdtree in the time of the Shattering and beyond. Indeed, if we look at the Serpent Hunter Spear, it gives us some interesting considerations, as it reads, thought to have been used to hunt an immortal great serpent in the distant past. It manifests a long blade of light when facing such a creature. Used to hunt an immortal great serpent in the distant past, meaning that there was a serpent crisis in the past before Rykard became the Serpent of Blasphemy. And this event would be so dire and so impactful upon society that the people of the Erdtree realm would make it a nemesis in gladiatorial combat, and would take delight in it being defeated in these mock battles. I'd always just assumed that the serpent was viewed as an enemy, because Iglay must have always been in opposition to the Erdtree. And for those unaware, the reason I refer to Iglay as the Great Serpent is because of the Temple of Iglay at Volcano Manor, which is a temple dedicated to the serpent, and thus we must assume that the name of this serpent is Iglay. Now, returning to that original comment by the Epic H88, while I don't necessarily agree that the Gloam-Eyed Queen herself is a serpent, it has always been interesting to me that the Godskin nobles have serpentine tails, and perhaps this suggests a sort of alliance between the Gloam-Eyed Queen and the Great Serpent. To me, the description of the gladiatorial set gives me biblical vibes. The serpent, thematically, has always been seen as the enemy to the Erdtree, much as the serpent is always seen as metaphorical for evil in the Bible. In the Garden of Eden, it is the snake that tempted Eve to take the forbidden fruit of knowledge, and in this case was the literal mouthpiece for Satan himself. Thus, through the serpent, the original sin is committed, and God's perfect creation is tainted. Indeed, as highlighted by Tarnished Archaeologist's tremendous video, the image of the serpent in the tree in the Garden of Eden is too similar to the imagery on the drawing room key of Volcano Manor, which for those unaware shows a serpent coils round a tree, in this case representative of the serpent's desire to consume and destroy the Erd Tree. Could it be that, like in the Bible, it was a serpent that first whispered in the ear of the Gloam-Eyed Queen and set her on her path? Could it have then aligned itself with her in her cause, helping her imbue the power of the serpent within her Godskin children, which is why the Godskin nobles have a serpentine tail, and why the Godskin Apostles are able to stretch and contort like a serpent? Does this also explain why a Godskin noble has now aligned itself with Rykard and the Serpent of Blasphemy? Is this an old alliance rekindled, so it can assist in creating a new serpentine warrior class, so that Rykard and his serpent children can succeed where the Godskins failed? Perhaps. This is all speculation, of course, but I have always wondered what this ancient enmity against the serpent is, and at the very least, we have the tales of the Godskin nobles to consider. These are ultimately serpentine tales, and we find a Godskin noble in the hotbed of a serpentine revolution. And perhaps the reason the serpent is so hated is because it assisted the Gloam-Eyed Queen and her apostles, and its union with Rykard is just the latest in its attempts to overthrow and hurt the Erd Tree. And if you want a deeper look at the serpent and its potential history of opposing the Erd Tree, I would thoroughly recommend Tarnished Archaeologist's video, Serpent and the Erd Tree. So what am I saying about the Gloam-Eyed Queen up to this point? Well, let me surmise. I believe that she was a queen of the same people as Queen Marika, potentially related to her, and I believe that she was chosen as an Empyrean. The Empyrean's rune was an inversion of Marika's, and she was the shadow of death to Marika's world of life. To channel her power, the Gloam-Eyed Queen had her signature sword forged, and would create an artificial lifeform specifically designed not only to wield this flame, but to bring death to the gods. In addition, it is possible that there was an alliance between the Gloam-Eyed Queen and the Great Serpent, cementing the serpents as an immortal enemy of the Erd Tree. There is one other matter regarding the Gloam-Eyed Queen's allies that we should talk about, and that is the issue of her shadow. As Ranni states, each Empyrean is granted a shadow, tailor-made to serve them. Ranni had Blythe, and Marika had Malekith, and given the Gloam-Eyed Queen was eventually defeated by the shadow of her opponent, it certainly would have been useful to have one. We know from Vargram's Raging Wolf set that he seeks to become such a shadow, and given his possession of the god-slaying great sword, it is clear that he seeks to become the shadow of the Gloam-Eyed Queen. However, given he is seeking to become one, it suggests that he failed in his quest, meaning he wasn't her actual shadow. The most obvious explanation is that we simply don't know who her shadow was, that the shadow was killed in the conflict of the Godskins, or met some unknown fate that we don't know about. When it comes to the actual identity of the Gloam-Eyed Queen, who do I believe it is? I have already presented some interesting theories, that she was a serpent, that she was the god-slaying greatsword herself, or merely an unnamed member of Numen or Nox society. However, if I was to put money on it now, I'm going to be rather boring and say that I do believe that Melina is the most likely candidate for the Gloam-Eyed Queen, Occam's razor after all. And when we do see her at the end of the Frenzied Flame ending, with her Gloam Eye, it is very compelling, but let's go into another few connections as to why Melina might well be the Gloam-Eyed Queen. Firstly, as we have stressed throughout this chapter, we do think it thematically fits that the Gloam-Eyed Queen would be tied to Numen, Nox, and Eternal City society, and Melina would also seem to tick these boxes of being related to this Numen people. First of all, the Black Knife assassins, who themselves are described as Numen and kin to Marika, use a technique that is also shared by Melina. We see this bladecraft when we summon her in our fight with Morgott, and if Melina was trained in the same combat techniques as other Numen women, it would suggest that Melina is also of this culture. Melina also refers to her mother within the Erd Tree.
Me? I'm searching for my purpose, given to me by my mother inside the Erd Tree, long ago.
And what is inside the Erd Tree? It's of course Marika, and again, the Gloam-Eyed Queen, an Empyrean, being the daughter of Marika, would fit in with everything else we know about other Empyreans who are also of royal blood. For me, one of the stronger arguments for Melina being the Gloam-Eyed Queen is how familiar she is with destined death, which would certainly make sense if she had been the Gloam-Eyed Queen at one point, a being who literally represented the Rune of Death. Indeed, we will return to this subject in the later chapters on the Godskins, but the fact that Melina is so familiar and understands such a nebulous concept as destined death, and knows that it is required to burn the Erd Tree, is very compelling evidence for me that she was once the wielder of destined death. And then, as mentioned, the real nail in the coffin for many people is the finale of the Frenzied Flame ending, when Melina appears with her Gloam Eye, an eye that was previously sealed, and she once again talks about destined death. And again, the colour of the eye is so particular. To me, it does seem to be a wink to the camera, a wink to the audience, that Melina was actually the Gloam-Eyed Queen, and she kept this part of her identity secret from us. So let me present my speculative analysis of Melina's past identity as the Gloam-Eyed Queen. She first of all claims that she is burned and bodiless, and is ultimately a bit confused as to why she is still here.
Me? I'm searching for my purpose, given to me by my mother inside the Erd Tree, long ago, for the reason that I yet live, burned and bodiless.
Indeed, we do see burn scars all over Melina's hands, suggesting that in her corporeal life, she was burned. And we know that the Rune of Death manifests its power as a flame, whether that be the black and white flame of the Godskins, or the red and black flame wielded by Malekith. Would it not be a fitting punishment for the Gloam-Eyed Queen to be burned in the flames of death by Malekith? And given that Malekith wields the power of destined death within his blade, it isn't a stretch to believe that the Gloam-Eyed Queen burned to death. In addition, Melina's eye is sealed, and it is only unsealed at the ending of the Frenzied Flame. Why? Well, consider the chain of events that happens up to that point. In other playthroughs, Melina dies before destined death, or the Rune of Death, is unsealed by the Tarnished. She sacrifices herself in the Flame of Ruin, and then we later defeat Malekith and unbind the Rune of Death. However, in the Frenzied Flame ending, Melina does survive right to the end, so she survives to the point where the Rune of Death has been once again unsealed and is unleashed in the world. And now, Melina's eye is open. I believe it is sealed and unsealed, much like the Rune of Death, that it is literally connected to the power of destined death. This is the manifestation of the Rune of Death within her body, and so when it was sealed, her eye was sealed. When it is unleashed, her eye is open. As an aside, as for the tattoo on Melina's sealed eye, I don't have any more specific insight that anyone else has not already said. I do believe that these are talons, and they are representative of death, an allusion to the crow or raven-like death birds, no doubt. But talking about Melina's eye, there is another tie that could suggest that again could make her out to be the Gloam-Eyed Queen. Geraint is the alter ego or secret identity of Malekith, but this is after he has sealed destined death, the Rune of Death, within his actual body. In time it becomes part of him, and so he hungers for Deathroot. This is a yearning from the Rune of Death itself, who wants its forgotten fragments to be returned to it, as the Deathroot item description does make it clear that the Deathroot is the form that the Rune of Death takes, spreading throughout the lands between, following Godwyn's murder. And so Geraint gives us a tool to be able to track down these fragments, the Beast Eye. This stone talisman that takes the form of the eye has a violet iris that looks almost identical to the hue of Melina at the end of the Frenzied Flame ending. I have no doubt that this particular eye, with its purple hue, is meant to invoke the image of the Gloam-Eyed Queen, and thus is somehow able to connect with the power of the Rune of Death. And given it looks so starkly like Melina's eye, this is another solid bit of evidence that Melina is the Gloam-Eyed Queen. Returning to the concept of her being burned and bodiless, there is one other character who is in a similar position, Ranni, who no longer has her body. Both Melina and Ranni are able to disappear in a puff of blue sparkles, an observation made by Zyostorm in his video on Melina. This suggests that they are in a similar state, and indeed we know that Ranni slew her own body, an event we know of thanks to her own speeches and the description of the curse mark of death. Ranni's bodiless state came about through the manipulation of the Rune of Death, and indeed her true body also looks burned. If I am right about Melina being burned in Malekith's flame after her defeat, then perhaps she too was only killed in body, as a punishment, or so Marika could later burn her erstwhile daughter to her will. Or perhaps Marika simply couldn't bring herself to have Melina killed fully, and thus took a half measure by having her rendered bodiless. This is all my speculation, of course, but this is how I see Melina. The once Gloam-Eyed Queen was defeated by Malekith and burned in his red flames of death, but denied true death, being killed in body only. Now Marika is in a dire situation, imprisoned within the Erdtree, unable to take actions herself, so she calls upon her last resort, resurrecting the spirit of Melina, the disembodied spirit of her old enemy and daughter, and Marika directs Melina to help the Tarnished, to help bring this age to a close. Perhaps it is Marika who even encourages Melina to once again unleash destined death, though Melina makes it clear that no matter her mother's plan, Melina has decided that once again the world needs death.
Me? I'm searching for my purpose, given to me by my mother inside the Erdtree, long ago, for the reason that I yet live, burned and bodiless. There is something for which I must apologize. I've acted the Finger Maiden, yet can offer no guidance. I am no maiden. My purpose was long ago lost.
I think this is thematically very neat. Marika once denied destined death and the Gloam-Eyed Queen, yet now she is relying on them both to free her from her eternal imprisonment. Thank you so much for watching this short Elden Ring lore video. This lore video is a segment from a much larger and longer video on my main channel, and a link to the full video can be found in the description. If you are interested in more Elden Ring lore content, then be sure to subscribe here and on my main channel Smowtown. But until next time, I will see you in the lands between.